May 1940. Norway is invaded by German troops. Poland is already occupied. France is next. Britain stands alone against Nazi Germany. And it has no prime minister. A secret meeting is called in London to find one. In Germany, Hitler rallies fanatical troops. In Italy, Mussolini whips the crowd into a frenzy of war fever.
La dichiarazione di guerra è già stata consegnata agli ambasciatori.
But in Britain, there is no leader. The outgoing Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain, has already compromised with Germany, signing the shameful Munich Agreement. And to succeed him, the leading candidate is not exactly the kind of speaker that keeps you on the edge of your seat.
And I have no doubt that with your help, we can win through and so save the causes on which your civilization and ours both depend.
Lord Halifax is Foreign Secretary at the time, but to say the least, it's not his eloquence that will jolt Britain awake. And yet, as he walks into the secret meeting that will decide the next Prime Minister, Halifax is the favorite, despite his past support for appeasement with Germany before shifting to a tougher stance. Even Churchill, who is also attending, is ready to support him. But just before the meeting, in the shadows, one man turns the tide. This man is a master manipulator, an Irish playboy who sometimes claims to be Australian, an extravagant figure who has already lived 10 lives and says he's had 100. He will found a newspaper that remains a global reference to this day. He will become Minister of Information during the war, and he will inspire the creation of one of the most terrifying characters in world literature, Big Brother. Thanks to this man working behind the scenes, it is Churchill who will emerge from the meeting as Prime Minister. Thanks to him, Britain and the free world will soon hear these unforgettable words.
We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender!
He gives Churchill, for whom he is the personal secretary, one simple yet incredibly bold piece of advice. Advice that few men would have dared to say to his face, to this stormy-tempered man with a thunderous voice. He tells him to stay silent. When Lord Halifax's name is put forward as Prime Minister, Churchill is to remain absolutely still, to avoid alienating the others, to prevent sparking a wave of opposition against his unwavering stance. Winston Churchill honors the advice and holds his tongue when Chamberlain proposes Halifax. After 2 agonizing minutes of silence, Halifax finally breaks and declares that, as a member of the House of Lords, he does not believe himself best suited to lead the government. It worked. Churchill is now the only viable choice. On May 10, 1940, as German forces storm into the Netherlands and Belgium, Chamberlain resigns and advises King George VI to call upon Churchill to form a new government. That long silence likely altered the fate of Britain and the world. By beginning with silence, Churchill sets the stage to turn the tide of war, with the crucial backing of the United States.
Until in God's good time, the new world, with all its power and might, steps forth to the rescue and the liberation of the old.
It took vision and audacity to convince the old lion to keep his mouth shut. Audacity was never in short supply for Brendan Bracken, and never had been. He was born in 1901 in Ireland in a modest Catholic family. His father was an active member of what will later become the IRA, a secret organization fighting for Ireland's independence from the United Kingdom. Intrigue, secrecy, and the struggle for freedom are part of Brendan's life from the cradle. But his father died when he was only 3 years old. From a young age, he exhibited both self-confidence and defiance. He was passionate about history and languages, but frequently skipped school. At just 13, he launched his first newspaper, selling copies at school and to family members to earn money. His habitual truancy led to expulsion, and his exasperated mother enrolled him in a strict boarding school. Within 5 months, he ran away. At just 14, he disappeared for weeks. His mother tracked him down only through the unpaid bills he had left behind for hotels, a tailored suit, and a bowler hat. When she found him, he claimed he had been working as a journalist. Determined to discipline him, she sent him far away, to Austria, to make a man out of him. At 15, Bracken arrived in Melbourne in the midst of World War I and moved in with a cousin. He took on odd jobs, including teaching at a primary school and working on a sheep farm, but spending most of his time reading. He joined debating societies, sharpening his ability to craft narratives. By 1919, he returned to Ireland, only to find that his mother had remarried. He no longer felt at home in nationalist Catholic Ireland and made his way to England. Arriving in Liverpool, he approached the first man he saw wearing a bowler hat and asked, "What's the best school in England?" "Sedbergh," the man replied. Bracken set his sights on it. In the meantime, he landed a teaching position by claiming to be 4 years older and a graduate of the University of Sydney. A few months later, he applied to Sedbergh College, but was far too old to be admitted. Undeterred, he claimed this time to be 16 and an orphan from Australia. The deception worked, and he was accepted into one of England's most prestigious schools. He didn't stay long. Instead, he moved to London, working for various newspapers. Journalism and influence were his true passions. Information, the fine line between truth and fiction, was his playground. By day, he wrote stories for newspapers. By night, he told them. His quick wit, his outlandish tales, his towering height, and his fiery red hair captivated audiences. Through the editor of The Observer, he was introduced to Winston Churchill in the summer of 1923. Bracken was just 22. At the time, Churchill was at a low point. He had lost his ministerial position, been defeated in the last parliamentary election, and was suffering from ill health. He summed up his predicament grimly. "I found myself without an office, without a seat, without a party, and without an appendix." An instant rapport formed between the two. Churchill saw brilliance in the young Bracken and took him under his wing. Bracken had finally found a kindred and larger-than-life figure worthy of his talents. A few months later, Bracken led Churchill's campaign for the parliamentary elections. It ended in a defeat, but Churchill was ultimately elected the following year, in 1924. Their friendship and relationship became increasingly close. They were constantly together, and rumors began to spread. Their proximity, their red hair, their similar temperaments, everything seemed to align. Whispers circulated that Bracken was Churchill's illegitimate son, and they allowed the rumor to persist without denying it. Even Clementine, Churchill's wife, had her doubts. Winston responded to her in his characteristic manner. "I've checked the dates. They do not match." Indeed, the year before Brendan's birth, Churchill had been deployed in South Africa. While advising Winston Churchill, who had been appointed Chancellor of the Exchequer in 1924, effectively Britain's finance minister, Brendan was also building his media empire and fortune. He founded several publishing houses and newspapers. He took control of financial news and acquired 50% of The Economist. He became a prominent figure in the media. With his fortune secured, he ran for Parliament in 1929 and was narrowly elected. He launched his own political career just as Churchill entered the early stages of his wilderness years. Yet, Brendan remained fiercely loyal to his mentor. Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin referred to him as Churchill's faithful chela, a Hindu term meaning devoted disciple. But Brendan was more than just that. He was a steadfast friend, supporting Churchill during his bouts of what he called his Black Dog Depression. Throughout the 1930s, Churchill tried to warn Parliament and the public about the growing threat of Hitler's Germany. Yet, he was ridiculed, and the widespread preference for appeasement within Parliament turned him into a political outcast. In 1937, despite Churchill's warnings, the pacifist Neville Chamberlain became Prime Minister. When Chamberlain, with France's support, sacrificed Czechoslovakia to maintain peace, Churchill denounced the Munich Agreement. "You were given the choice between war and dishonor. You chose dishonor, and you will have war." And indeed, everything escalated on September 1st, 1939. Hitler invaded Poland. The very next day, Churchill was appointed First Lord of the Admiralty and joined the War Cabinet. Chamberlain's aim was to counterbalance the appeasers in his own ranks. Brendan was immediately appointed Churchill's parliamentary private secretary. He now had the chance to leverage all his connections and skills in service of Churchill, knowing that this return of the old lion to government was just one step in their broader battle against the Nazi threat. Indeed, a few months later, Chamberlain resigned, and thanks to the pivotal moments of silence that Bracken advised Churchill to employ, he was named Prime Minister.
I have nothing to offer but blood, toil, tears, and sweat.
Churchill included Bracken in his inner circle, despite the king's objections, as George VI questioned his lack of ministerial experience. But Churchill responded, "He has, at times, been almost my only support in the years when I struggled to properly defend this country." There was no doubt. Brendan was an intimate confidant. He even moved out of his home and took up residence at the Prime Minister's residence for the duration of the war. He was entirely at ease in Churchill's presence. He was the only person who could walk into Churchill's office unannounced and joke with him freely. On one occasion, Brendan even used one of Churchill's cigar butts to light his own cigarette. Churchill, only half-joking, remarked, "I have killed men for less than that." Nothing could stop him. He knew how valuable his place was to the man who affectionately called him Dear Brendan. Churchill sought his opinion on every government and war cabinet appointment, but Bracken also gave unsolicited advice, involving himself in matters as varied as the appointment of Cambridge's director and the selection of new Anglican bishops. He knew everyone and helped everyone. One winter day in 1940-41, President Roosevelt sent his top advisor, Harry Hopkins, to Britain. This man, whom one of his founding fathers of modern Europe, Jean Monnet, described as the unofficial chief of staff of American power, did not spend his time at 10 Downing Street with Churchill, but with Bracken. The two men, both masters of discretion, spoke at length. Brendan managed to convince Hopkins that Britain would hold firm and that it desperately needed U.S. support, where Churchill travels in 1942.
I cannot help reflecting that if my father had been American and my mother British, instead of the other way around, I might have got here on my own.
After multiple attempts by Churchill, Brendan finally agreed to take a ministerial post. In July 1941, he became Minister of Information.
His post is taken by Mr. Brendan Bracken. You've probably seen him quite often in newsreels without realizing he was Mr. Churchill's parliamentary private secretary.
He was determined to completely reform the ministry and restore trust among newspapers that feared government censorship and wartime propaganda.
Mr. Brendan Bracken succeeds Mr. Duff Cooper as Minister of Information and immediately sets out personally to greet journalists from all over the world. The new minister promises the gentlemen of the press that he intends making the ministry into a real news distributing body.
Throughout the war, Bracken led the ministry successfully, earning the respect of newspaper editors and providing exclusive information in carefully measured doses, maintaining strict control over wartime communication. For Bracken controlled everything. He was committed to absolute truth, but his truth. He reviewed, verified, and approved every detail. His civil servants feared him, referring to him simply as BB. One of them took notes on his experience and began to imagine a world where the Ministry of Information would become the Ministry of Truth, and where the omnipotent BB at its helm would evolve into Big Brother. This vision became the foundation of a book that would achieve worldwide fame, 1984, written under the pseudonym George Orwell. At the end of the war, Bracken was briefly appointed First Lord of the Admiralty, but the 1945 government shift left him, like Churchill, in opposition. Returning to business, he merged his financial news media group with the Financial Times, which he acquired in 1945. He completely overhauled the newspaper, laying the foundations for the modern Financial Times, now a global authority on economic journalism. Since 1955, the paper's headquarters has borne his name, Bracken House. When Churchill returned as Prime Minister in 1951, Bracken, for health reasons, withdrew from politics. Instead, he managed the Churchill's family growing fortune, amassed through the sales of Winston's books, one of which earned Churchill the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1953. Bracken was also the mastermind behind a media cover-up designed to conceal Churchill's severe stroke in 1953. The goal was clear: to allow his mentor to remain in office as Prime Minister. It was Bracken's last act of loyalty to the man he had supported for over 30 years. As his health deteriorated, Bracken withdrew from public life, and in 1958, at just 57 years old, he died of throat cancer. Like his mentor, Winston Churchill, he was a heavy smoker. On his deathbed, he gave his final order to his loyal chauffeur: "Burn all my papers." A man of shadows who cherished obscurity, Brendan Bracken likely took many secrets to his grave.